If the Gospel of John really is, in part, a polemic, then who or what was John writing against? I suggest that the Gospel of John's targets can be broken down into three general categories, all of which were causing problems for John's community during the time of the Gospel's composition. 1. Non-Christian Jews. 2. The Baptist sect. And 3. Gnostics. One potential strength of this multi-front view is that it does not force John's focus too narrowly in one direction. We need not neglect either the Gospel's visible contest with the Jews or its incredible parallels with Gnostic thinking and literature. Resolving both the Jewish and Gnostic conflicts is to be seen as part of the Johannine mission to establish a Jesus congenial to both the Jewish and Greek mind, and to prove the viability and superiority of John's Jewish Christianity. In as complex and cosmopolitan a gospel as John's, it is not surprising that he could and would battle on multiple fronts. As E.F. Scott rightly observed, we should today view the Gospel of John as a carefully formulated answer to certain groups of opponents who can still, at least in a general way, be identified. Polemic against Jews who reject Jesus and his followers. First, we will briefly consider the Gospel of John as an anti-Jewish polemic. While the prospect of anti-Semitism in the Gospel of John has long proven a popular topic of investigation, scholarship has refocused, and rightly so, on John as a work from within Judaism. The Dead Sea Scrolls have provided a basis for locating Johannine thought, so often said to represent either overt Hellenistic intrusion or novel Trinitarian revelation, squarely within Palestinian Judaism. As James McGrath confirms, quote, "We are correct, with the majority of scholars, to set the fourth gospel in the context of Judaism. It is in no way implausible to suggest that John's gospel is correctly classed as Jewish Christian and does not demonstrate distance from Judaism. The burden of proof rests on those who seek to deny a Jewish/Jewish Christian setting for the fourth evangelist community in gospel." End quote. Nevertheless, the Jews are the regular opponents of John's Jesus. Many scholars have interpreted this peculiar language as reflecting not an anti-Semitic attitude, but an intra-Jewish factional dispute. John clashes, probably, with Jewish religious authorities. While this view may not be universal, James Dunn notes that the boundaries and definitions of John's factional dispute were in fact part of that dispute. If we remove the gospel from this context, only then might it be possible to glean any anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism from John. In the end, as McGrath says, the burden of proof lies more on those who look to set John against Judaism. As many scholars have proposed, the Gospel of John's antagonism with the Jews is probably directed at traditionalist Jewish authorities in the writer's environment, who had rejected or even expelled Jewish Christians from their communities. This expulsion was not due to any reformulated monotheism proposed by the Johannine community. Again, monotheism is not an object of debate in the Gospel of John, but rather it was on the basis of Christian acceptance and promotion of Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah. These Jews appear to have rejected Jesus and the salvation which his disciples claimed he presented, in favor of the more traditional mediators of God's covenantal promises to Israel, such as Moses and Abraham. Thus, the Gospel's polemics towards these Jews are largely focused on establishing Jesus as the Messiah and demonstrating what Jesus as Messiah offers over Moses and Abraham. For example, in John 5:45, the Jews claim to have no need for Christ and have looked instead to Moses. Jesus responds by saying that if the Jews really believed in Moses, the one in whom they have put their hope, then they would follow Jesus, since Moses had written about him. Quote, "But since you do not believe what he wrote," Jesus says, "how will you believe what I say?" End quote. Likewise, in John 8:31 through 59, the Jews claim to have no need for Christ on the basis of their hereditary connection to Abraham. Quote, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free?" Jesus responds by claiming to have priority over Abraham, being the Messiah, or designated as the Messiah, long before Abraham was even born. Episodes of this sort are buttressed by warnings from Jesus about his followers being expelled from the synagogue for bravely accepting him as Messiah. See John 9:22, 12:42, and 16:12. In this way, John works against his Jewish opponents on the one hand, while also providing context and comfort for the Johannine community in the wake of rejection. Since the focus of our investigation is rather on the Gospel's third class of opponents, the Gnostics, and within that class, Hermeticism, the above description will provide at least a rudimentary introduction to the subject of John's Jewish conflict. Polemic against the Baptist sect. Here I will provide a brief consideration of another class of opponents, the Baptist sect. The fourth Gospel's treatment of John the Baptist has moved many scholars to perceive a conflict between John's Christianity and persistent elements of the historical Baptist community. In the Synoptics, John the Baptist was portrayed as a great preacher and reformer, working alongside of Jesus and even baptizing him. In the Gospel of John, however, his position changes. He is now one who openly testifies that he is not the one that people are looking for, and that his chief purpose is only to point others to Jesus before he himself disappears. See John 3:29 through 30. John evidently directs his own disciples to leave him and follow after Jesus. John 1:35 through 37. John's own light was only for a season. John 5:35. And John's baptism of Jesus is omitted from the fourth Gospel completely. The Gospel ultimately makes too clear the subordination of the Baptist to Jesus. John is not worthy to even untie Jesus' sandals. John 1:27. Furthermore, in later chapters, the Jesus movement even outperforms the Baptist sect in regard to converts. John 4:1 says, "The Pharisees had heard Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John." Even the role of water baptizer appears to be portrayed as a role beneath the office and dignity of Jesus. In John 4:2, Jesus himself does not even baptize, but he leaves that duty to his subordinate disciples. These and other passages have led many scholars to conclude that after John the Baptist's death, his sect continued to flourish and even to compete with the Johannine community. Later, in the pseudo-Clementine literature, we indeed find Christians complaining that, quote, "some even of the disciples of John, who seem to be great ones, have separated themselves and proclaimed their own master as Christ." End quote. E.F. Scott argues that this evidences, quote, "not only a Baptist party existing alongside of the church, but of an active controversy with it, which was still in process at the beginning of the 3rd century." End quote. Thus we seem warranted in concluding that John's Gospel was drawn partly to correct the record in the face of such a controversy. John 3:27 through 28 reads, "John replied, 'You yourselves can testify that I said, I am not the Christ, but am sent ahead of him.'" As Scott furthermore notes, quote, "It may well have been that in the Baptist's own lifetime extravagant claims were put forward on his behalf, but if they had been abandoned after his death, there was no need to disprove them by elaborate evidence. We can only infer that the relative positions of John and Jesus were still debated in the circles for which the Gospel was written, and that in his account of the person and work of the Baptist, the writer is influenced by a direct polemical intention." End quote. Observations like these were what eventually led scholars like M. Lidzbarski, R. Reitzenstein, and R. Bultmann to seek out and form a connection between the later Mandean Baptist sect in John's Baptist sect, and ultimately with the most primitive Christianity. While Bultmann's specific conclusions about Mandeism were overdrawn, as Dodd demonstrated, the claims of Johannine antagonism with the Baptist sect are still warranted. Whatever form that Baptist opposition took in the years following the Fourth Gospel's writing, it is clear that John found them powerful enough to at least potentially detract from his community and message. As the Clementine literature proves, that fear continued to be felt by later Christians. Polemic against Gnosticism. Regarding the gnosis-inclined adversaries of John, this third class of opponents appears to have consisted of Christian Gnostics, Gnostic Jews, Hermeticists, and or other Gnosticizing syncretistic groups. If this second class of opponents, which I have collectively labeled Gnostics, seems broad, it is due to the nearly uncontainable nature of gnosis, a trend born in the philosophical latitude and syncretistic spirit of Middle Platonism. On the one hand, the term Gnostic has been used rather narrowly. It is, in fact, the self-given name of an ancient Christian sect, which scholars have since identified as the Sethians, the Barbelo-Gnostics, or the Ophites. However, beyond this limited sense, Gnostic has also proven a broad term used to describe a fluid category of religions developing in the 1st to 2nd centuries CE, which may not be confined by, or even dependent upon, Christian tradition. Exactly what qualifies as a Gnostic religion has become the subject of endless debate. Michael Williams' book, Rethinking Gnosticism, certainly forced historians to be more careful in their use of the term Gnostic. Despite Williams' protest against the word, however, I will continue to use it in this study, as I did in my book, The God of Jesus in Light of Christian Dogma, 2016, because I continue to see the value of Gnosticism in related terms. Barnstone and Meyer are correct, I believe, in framing Williams' concern in the following way. Quote, Williams' recognition of Gnostic diversity merely parallels the similar recognition by scholars of diversity in Judaism and Christianity. This recognition has also led Jacob Neusner to suggest Judaisms and Jonathan Z. Smith Christianities as appropriate terms for these diverse religious movements. Perhaps we might also opt for Gnosticisms or Gnostic religions as a similar way of acknowledging the differences among religions of Gnosis. End quote. I agree with Barnstone and Meyer also in their insistence on utilizing this terminology as a means of comparison and classification. Essentially, my view is that certain traditions will inevitably not share in every characteristic, but that each tradition will nevertheless prove more like one than another. Thus, my usage of Gnosticism will tend towards that broader usage which serves to indicate a fluid collection of religious beliefs which do share in several fundamental qualities. These qualities often include, but are not limited to, an emphasis on salvation from the material world through the acquisition of gnosis, mystical and intimate knowledge of the divine, a demiurgical cosmogony, and at least a tendency towards dualistic thinking. Used in this sense, Gnosticism would include not only Christian Gnostic sects like the Sethians, but also pagans like the Hermeticists, and possibly some Neoplatonists. Furthermore, I will continue to use the word gnosis to describe the philosophical trend which embodies the sensibilities which contributed to the formation of the various Gnostic groups. As Smalley rightly put it, Gnosticism is, in fact, more a climate of thought than a religious system. Ultimately, I expect that readers will be keen enough to distinguish between the use of Gnosticism to describe a broader religious movement, Christian Gnosticism to describe the various sects within that movement which are largely dependent on Christian tradition, and finally, terms like Sethians and Valentinians to describe those unique Christian Gnostic sects. I will not embark on the mystifying question of Gnostic origins. It is only necessary for our study that we recognize the diversity of the traditions which have been approached with the Gnostic label. Indeed, Gnosticism is probably best viewed as a many-headed hydra, as it can be seen as falling into definite patterns or groups. We could also envision the original Gnostic trend as the hub of a wheel from which diverse spokes radiate. Being part of the same wheel, and in their origins connected to the same philosophical and religious concerns, each spoke shares fundamental qualities, but in the end prove distinct and parallel. R. M. Grant was comfortable with classifying several unique types of Gnosticism: Oriental religion, Zoroastrianism, Mesopotamian and Indian; heterodox Judaism, apocalyptic and mystical; heterodox Christianity and late Hellenistic philosophy, especially incipient Neoplatonism. To this last proposed category, we could doubtless add the Hermetic tradition of Gnosis, which bears the greatest focus of our present inquiry. As Groningen surmises, however, quote, "Whether one attempts to type Gnosticism according to leading spirits, to cultic practices, to geographical environment, to specific phenomena from which it originated, or to documents, Gnosticism remains an elusive, many-headed hydra." End quote. It is not the aim of this particular study to draw out every parallel with Gnostic thought located in John's Gospel, nor is it its aim to pinpoint exactly which Gnostic sects John had in mind and which he did not. It is important to remember that Gnosticism is indeed a syncretistic climate of thought embodied in a wide range of traditions, and that each expression of Gnosis had the power and opportunity to shape the others. However, I am willing to identify certain Gnostic traditions which I believe were of value to some of the opponents of the fourth gospel. But again, when I say that Hermeticism was a target of John, I do not mean to limit John's polemic to Hermeticists, that is, to a particular pagan, non-Christian group. One of the mistakes often made when attempting to identify the Gnostic opponents of John is the failure to properly account for the vast interchange between religious groups in that period. One example of a highly syncretistic Gnostic sect, which represents a great confluence of religious traditions, is the sect of the Gnostics. Indeed, as we will consider later, this sect may have even been among those which John had in mind when writing his Gospel. The Gnostics are usually classed as Christian Gnostic, but in reality, they owe just as much to overtly pagan traditions and to Hellenistic philosophical traditions like Hermeticism. Thus, when I say that the Gospel of John targets Hermeticism, I do not mean that it necessarily has a pure Hermeticism in view, but that it could be targeting just as easily Hermetic ideas or Hermetic literature which were being appreciated or appropriated by parallel sects, or which had been synchronized with quasi-Christian tradition, as we may find in the Gnostics. Are we then able to simply identify parallel streams of thought in any Gnostic sect or writing and declare that sect or writing to have been in John's mind? No. We are not justified in identifying only one or two similarities with John in any body of literature and claiming they were also John's targets. A similar emphasis and concentration of ideas in the proposed Gnostic source should be mirrored in the Gospel. Furthermore, if any particular sect or body of literature is to be convincingly proposed as an opponent of John's, it must be able to demonstrate not only a quality, quantity, and concentration of affinities, but it also must be able to be located in the historical vicinity of John's writing. This was, perhaps, the greatest pitfall of Bultmann, and one which we will be careful to avoid. But at present, I believe we are safe in simply identifying the general streams of thought with which John interacts, regardless of whichever specific sect generated or appropriated them. In this way, we may confidently identify one of John's Gnostic targets as Christian Gnosticism and another target as Hermeticism, without need to conclusively identify a single named historical sect or teacher which accounts for all the Gnostic parallels in the Gospel. In the end, John may not write against any one sect, but against a world of ideas which contain both Gnostic Christian and Hermetic fashions. But what are some objections to the idea that the Gospel of John is in part an anti-Gnostic polemic? In our next entry, I will answer several possible objections to my proposal that John is working against Gnosticism.